Hello students, welcome again. Students, in today's video lecture, we want to discuss W.H. Auden's contribution to English poetry during the 20th century. Auden, who is considered as a great modernist poet, is also known as the poet of war, a poet of experimentation, which we are going to discuss all these different facets of his poetry in this video lecture. Auden, born in 1907 and died in 1973, was the witness of the First World War and the Second World War, and that's why the theme of war, the theme of death, you find in most of his poems, and that's why he has been considered as the poet of war. Auden is also known as an Anglo-American poet. Why Anglo-American? Because in the initial stage of his life, he was living in England. Later on, he migrated to America. So he's both an American poet and also an English poet. That's why people call him an Anglo-American poet. Auden was much influenced by the poetry of Ezra Pound, by the poetry of Eliot, Hopkins, and Kipling, and he was also influenced by the psychological theories of Sigmund Freud and socialism of Karl Marx. Okay, so all these influences are visible in his poetry. Okay, he has been acclaimed, as I told you, as a modern poet, as a poet of experimentation, as a poet of war, and all these things we are going to discuss in this video lecture. On the screen now, these are some of the poems which are very popular: Lullaby, Funeral Blues, okay, Autumn Song, As I Walked Out One Evening, The Unknown Citizen, The Fall of Rome, The Shield of Achilles. These are some very popular poems which have made W.H. Auden a great poet of modernism. Now, see, if you examine the whole career of Auden, you find two clear phases in his life. Okay, what are these two phases? In the first phase, he was much influenced by Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. So Marxist theory and Freudian theory of psychology are visible in his initial poems which he wrote in his early stage. Okay, here the main theme of his early poems are what? He talks about social criticism. He shows his protest against the social orthodoxy, and the early poems also express his reaction to some political, social, and economic issues of his countries during the 1930s. In the second phase, okay, which begins after 1940s onwards, there you find a change, a sudden change in his attitude to writing poetry. Here now he from socialism, he focuses his attention on the identity of the individual, how the individual fights back against the social obstacles and odds. Okay, The Unknown Citizen is a nice example of a satire on the loss of this individuality in a bureaucratic society. So this change you find in his later poems, you find that he becomes a little bit religious, and you find this metaphysics in his poems, in his last poem. So clearly these two phases are evident in his poetry. Now the most important point that comes to our mind when we discuss W.H. Auden as a poet, and that is Auden is the great modern poet. He is a poet of modernism. Professor Beach, an important critique, he calls Auden a typically modern poet. Okay, if you examine the themes of his poetry, or if you examine his poetic techniques or structure of his poems, from both the angles you can prove that he was indeed a modernist poet. Moreover, if you see the themes, then the theme of love, the theme of death, and theme of war, these are the major themes which we find in his poems. And death and war, these are the facets, these are the tenets of modernism. Okay. Moreover, experimentation is also found in all modern literatures. Anti-romanticism is also one of the characteristics of modernism. All these things are found in his poetry. One by one we are going to discuss all these things. So first of all, let's examine the themes of his poems which make him a modern poet. Number one, the theme of love. He has written many poems like the Funeral Blues, Are You There? These are the poems where he has presented the theme of love in combination with grief. Grief means sorrow. Okay, he has combined these two ideas of love and sorrow in both these poems. I have taken these two lines from his poem The Funeral Blues. Read these two lines where you find this combination: my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever, but I was wrong. So the poet says that love would last for long, forever, but then he says, I was wrong. So pain, grief with love is combined here in this poem. Let me give you another example. If you read another poem, Are You There? Which was written in 1963, there also you find this combination. Read these lines. Each lover has some theory of his own about the difference between the ache means pain, okay, difference between the pain of being with his love and being alone. Whether you are there with your lover, there also you have pain, and if you are away from your lover, there also you have pain. So pain and love are combined together in his poems. The theme of death is prevalent in most of his poems, and this makes him a modern poet. Why? Because in modernism this was the major theme. Death is a common theme in his poems. He lived through both the wars, the First World War 1914 to 18 and the Second World War. These two world wars were witnessed by W.H. Auden, and that's why there is a deep impact of these wars and after effects on his poetry. He has presented these themes in the Funeral Blues, also in the poem In Memory of Sigmund Freud, in his very popular poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. You find these lines: he disappeared in the dead of winter. He talks about the death of W.B. Yeats, and he says he disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted. So the whole deserted life of the modern man after the war has been presented here. The frustration, the destruction of the societies and cultures. This was the scenario after the two world wars, which he has tried to draw in his poems. Moreover, you also find the theme of war. Auden, I told you, he lived during this period where he saw these two world wars, okay, and he has been termed as a war poet. The world wars impacted his life and his poetry. Okay, Auden has portrayed the causes and impacts of war in many of his poems. I have taken this one example from the poem September 1, 1939. There he has written these lines: what all school children learn, those to whom evil is done, do evil in return. Our school education, what do they teach? Okay, what does the school education teach the children? The children learn that if somebody is doing some evil with you, you do evil with him or her. So this was the scenario during the World War. In another poem, The Shield of Achilles, which was published in 1952, you find these lines: a million eyes, a million boots in line. He has described the army, okay, a million eyes, a million boots in line without expression, waiting for the sign. Okay, so this is how the army has been described by Auden. If you read another poem, In the Praise of Limestone, published in 1948, read these lines. There also you find these things. Watch then the band of rivals as they climb up and down their steep stone gunnels in twos and threes at times, in arm in arm, but never, thank God, in stab. Here also, the whole army, the war scene has been created by the poet. Okay, so that's why he has been considered as a war poet. Another, I have taken one more example in the Memory of W.B. Yeats. There he writes these lines: in the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequence in his state. Here, the poet is trying to say that all the European nations are crying for the war. They are ready for the war, and they are crying just like the dogs barking loudly. Okay, so such was the scenario during the times of world wars, which Auden has realistically presented in his poems, and that makes him a war poet. That makes him a modern poet. Moreover, another feature of modernism is anti-romanticism. So, what is romanticism can never be modern, and what is modern can never be romanticism. Both are opposites. Okay, and Auden, a poet, is a kind. To Auden, poetry is what? If you ask Auden what is poetry, then he said that poetry is a kind of a poet is a kind of a chemist who mixes two different chemicals. Okay, here the poet mixes two different elements like words while remaining detached from his own feelings. So feelings of the poet are different and his words are different. You remember T.S. Eliot, Tradition and Individual Talent. There Eliot has also given the same theory of poetry. He said that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions, it is an escape from emotions. Okay, so W.H. Auden, who was much influenced by T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry, he says these things, that feelings and emotional experiences were the only occasion which participated into his mind the idea of a poem. So how the poem is created according to him, the feelings of the poet are mixed with the thought, and words are used by the poet, but the poet remains detached. This objective nature is known as anti-romanticism. Okay, this is unlike all other romantics. Auden was very much interested in communicating his views to his readers and a possible to establish a rapport with them. Okay, so the poet here communicates with the readers. He himself, I have taken these lines written by Auden himself. He himself has said that those who have no interest in communications do not become artists at all. Okay, a great artist must be able to communicate with his readers directly. They become mystics or madmen if they do not do this. So Auden believes that romantics, the romantic poets, they are mystics and they are mad people. Why? Because they did not communicate directly with the readers. But Auden has always written poems which communicate directly with the readers. Another important feature which makes him a modern poet is experimentation. You see, the 20th century is what? 20th century is the period of science and technology and experiments in the field of science and technology. So the influence of this science and technology you find in Auden's poetry also. Okay, he has done many experiments with poetry, with the art of poetry writing. He has experimented with free verse, blank verse, ballad meter, and so on. James Fenton, an important historian, he wrote these lines for years, for over 40 years. The technical experimentation started by Auden enlarged and enriched the scope of English verse. So he wants to say that for 40 years, Auden has done experiments in poetry writing and has influenced the other poets and English poetry. He rediscovered and invented more than any other modern poet. Okay. So as far as experimentation is concerned, you cannot even compare Auden with any other modern poets. So experimentation makes him a modern poet. But the last important thing that we must note about W.H. Auden is obscurity in his poetry. Obscurity means you find it very difficult to understand his poetry. That makes him a difficult poet. Okay, why? Because he has an extraordinary style and extraordinary diction. Why? Because he has done experiments with poetry, and that makes him an obscure poet. His language is telegraphic language. Okay, here connections, conjunctions, articles, even the pronouns are missing. He deletes these things. Okay, the difficulty is created further by his frequent use of the terminology from modern psychology. Okay, now see, as a reader, if you are not well versed with psychology, then you won't be able to understand his poetry. So that makes him a difficult poet. Moreover, he coins new words, just like William Shakespeare and Edmund Spenser. He has the habit of coining new words. Okay, he uses some obsolete and unfamiliar, unusual words in his poems, which make his poetry difficult. And sometimes some abstract nouns are personified. Okay, and they are written with capital letters. So experimentation with language, with meter, with rhyme, with verse, all these things make his poetry obscure or difficult. But we may conclude by saying that he is indeed a great modernist poet. Why? Because his poetry is infused with the ideas of the modern man's frustration, modern man's the idea of destruction after the world wars has been picturized by Auden in his poetry. Moreover, the art of experimentation in poetry also makes him a great modern poet. His war poetry makes him a modern poet. Okay, all in all, because of his great contribution to English poetry, National Book Committee awarded him National Medal for Literature in 1967. After Auden's death in 1973, Joseph Brodsky wrote about him, and he said that his was the greatest mind of the 20th century. Auden was the greatest mind of the 20th century according to Joseph Brodsky. So here we come to the end of this lecture. If you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel. Please subscribe to this channel and click on the bell icon so that whenever I upload a new video, you might get the notification. Thank you for watching. Thank you.